This podcast is brought to you by Aetna. Learn how Aetna is working to build a healthier world by visiting aetnastory.com.
Hi, it's Doro, and I'm so excited to announce that the Achieving Optimal Health Conference is just around the corner on October 26th at Georgetown University. For our Health Gig listeners, we have a special offer. If you sign up by September 20th, you'll get $50 off your ticket. Just go to achievingoptimalhealthconference.com and use the code HealthGig. Get ready to create a happier and healthier life story.
People are yearning for information. Having the opportunity to encourage people and to educate people and inspire people.
It's amazing to be able to say we'll carve out time to take care of ourselves.
There's something for everyone.
Welcome to the BB&R Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Riley Cook.
And I'm your host, Dora Bush Cook.
Thank you for listening. We are so excited that we get to do this podcast and help people learn how to take better care of themselves by interviewing thought leaders and experts in health and wellness about their personal health journeys.
In this episode, we're talking to Dan Seigel, who is so impressive. He's a psychiatrist, a speaker, the author of a ton of books, the director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, and executive director of the Mindsight Institute. He's actually with us now because we heard him speak and said, oh my gosh, we need him on our podcast. So we waited after his talk and ambushed him and asked him to join us.
We can't wait for you to hear his description of the mind, mindfulness, and meditation as mind training, particularly his practice of the wheel. But the idea that the mind is a verb, not a noun, is so astonishing and opens up so many avenues for discussion that we know you'll walk away from this episode completely blown away. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Dan Seigel, and we'll check back in with you at the end of the program. We're just thrilled you're here and glad that we came to your session this morning. It was awesome.
Well, thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Doro. It's really exciting to be here with you, and thank you for coming this morning.
Oh, we loved it. So why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and why it's important for us to know the work that you do, and tell us all about the bicycle wheel. That's how I learned it. It was the bicycle wheel.
Yes. Yes. Who I am. Well, of course, that's a question we all should ask ourselves.
Right.
So, the name I have is Dan Seigel, and that means that I'm a person with a name like the rest of us, but it also means that I've been working for a long time bringing together different fields to literally integrate these fields from different branches of science to try to bring more well-being into the world, and that field is called Interpersonal Neurobiology. So I'm trained as a physician, and then trained in psychiatry, and then trained as a researcher, and then I'm also a practicing psychotherapist.
Wow.
So with all those different things, mostly what I do is try to bring fields, let's say math and physics and chemistry together with biology, including neuroscience and the study of the brain, with medicine and psychology and sociology and linguistics and anthropology, all those fields, and say, what if we had a field of health that drew on all the fields of science? So that's called Interpersonal Neurobiology, and in a series of books that I'm the editor of, the founding editor, we have at Norton over 60 textbooks now, if you want to read about this, that I've overseen the publication of. So there's a lot of science behind the kinds of things we can talk about, but my excitement really is about, in terms of what I do, how to translate that science for practical use in everyday life so people can bring more well-being into their lives, integrating the sciences across different approaches to well-being.
Wow. That is incredible. Wow. Tell us a little bit about your background, though, before we get started. Where were you born, and who are your parents?
Where was I born? I was born in a small shack. No, I was born in a big hospital on Hope Street with B-positive blood, so I'm an optimist.
Yes.
And I was born in Los Angeles, and my parents were from New York, and so I was the first Californian born there, and I live there in California at the Mindsight Institute, was where I work in Santa Monica, California, And we're an educational institution that really tries to bring things out into the larger world. But in terms of where I grew up just a little bit east of there in the center part of LA.
Awesome. So can you start with the wheel? Could you describe to us the wheel and how that works and why that's important and why we need to know about it?
Yeah. Well, Patricia, it's really an interesting sort of journey, really, where for me as a physician, I was struck at how we never talked about the mind. And then when I went through pediatrics and then psychiatry training, the mind was never defined. Even though you'd want parents to help develop a healthy mind in their kids, or in psychiatry you'd working with the mind, strangely, that word, M-I-N-D, mind, had no definition. So this drove me to become a researcher. And so in that journey, then it was the beginning of the decade of the brain, the 1990s. I think President Bush actually declared it the decade of the brain. I remember correctly.
Yes, he did.
Someone you may know, Dora.
Yes.
And at that moment, then everyone would say, okay, we're learning all this technology about the brain. What can we do with it? Now, it turns out Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, said the mind is only what comes out of the brain in your head. And William James in 1890 reaffirmed that. But for me, when I became a researcher in what's called attachment, relationships between a child and a parent, the mind was, yes, of course, a part of the brain, but it was the whole body and also the relationships we'd have with other people and maybe with the larger world around us. So that started a journey in the 1990s, the early 90s, to say, could the mind be more than just activity in the brain, in your head? And through a long series of deep dives into the sciences I mentioned, what came out were two findings. One was that when you look at the idea of the mind as being both embodied, so fully embodied, not just in your head, but also relational, you could see that the mind might be what's called a self-organizing, emergent aspect of a system of energy and information flow that's both within you and between you and the world. And then if you ask the question, well, if the mind is this self-organizing process, what would a healthy mind be? And it turns out there's an answer from math. Applied mathematics of complex systems says that the way you optimize this flow of regulation called self-organization is you link differentiated parts. What that means is you allow parts to be different, like two people in a relationship, and then you allow them to communicate with respect. Or you link the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. It doesn't matter what level of system, but that process we can just call integration. And so in the work that I was doing as a therapist and as a scientist, for me, integration, the linking of differentiated parts, was the basis of well-being. It allowed you to be flexible and adaptive and coherent, which means resilient and energized and stable. And basically, it's the foundations for harmony. And so the proposal back then was integration is the basis of health. And then the second big point that came from that was consciousness, awareness needed to be there for change to happen. So then I thought, what if I help my patients, the people I was working with clinically, what if I help them integrate consciousness? So there was a table in my office, and what we did was I had them come off the chair or the couch where they were sitting, come around this table. And the table, if you ever come to the Institute, you'll see the table. It's got a glass center that's clear and a wooden rim. And I said, okay, picture this as like a wheel, like you have a center hub and an outer rim. Let's call it the wheel of awareness, so that we're going to differentiate and link aspects of consciousness. And my patients would look at me like I was nuts. And I would say, no, this is how you do it. You put the knowns on the rim, like what you see or hear or taste or touch or smell. Or what you feel in your body, or your thoughts and feelings, things like that. Those would be the knowns on the rim. And then in the hub, you have the knowing, the experience of awareness itself, so that they could differentiate, make different, distinguish, allow them to be specialized, the awarenessing called knowing from the knowns. Like if I say, hello, Doro, or I say, hello, Patricia, you have both the hello that's on the rim, it's a sound,
Right.
but you also have the awareness that I said hello, right? So then you have a spoke that's a metaphoric spoke of attention, where you direct where attention goes. And then we would move the spoke around the rim like you did this morning. And amazingly, people would have anxiety be reduced, mild to moderate depression would be reduced, stress would be reduced, even dealing with traumas. So we've worked with people in the military, for example. Working with traumas has been reduced. I recently did this for the Navy SEAL Foundation, 700 people in a room, all doing the wheel practice you did. And it's so accessible. It comes from science. It basically says, hey, if consciousness is needed for change, and if you want to change towards health and integration is the basis of health, why not integrate consciousness? And it strengthens the mind by building on three things. It strengthens the mind by focusing attention in the first two segments, opening awareness in the third segment, and then the fourth segment, you actually become aware of your connections. So it opens up a sense of kind intention. And research has shown if you do those three things in a regular practice, focused attention, open awareness, and kind intention training, you actually strengthen the mind and integrate the brain and create health in your levels of an enzyme that repairs your ends of your chromosomes called telomerase. You improve the epigenetic regulators, these non-DNA molecules that regulate gene expression. You actually improve them to reduce inflammation. You improve your immune function, you improve your cardiovascular factors like heart rate and blood pressure and cholesterol levels, and you have an overall sense of well-being. So that's what the research shows if you do those three things, and the wheel practice has each of the three foundations of these kind of mind training practices that create traits of health.
There's so much science behind mindfulness now that people are hearing about. What have you seen, what effect has that had on people coming to practice, to mindfulness practice? Or have you seen a huge change in that people coming?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it, Doro? I mean, when these things were becoming clear in science, it was in the 90s, before the term mindfulness was popular and known, and the practice of training the mind called meditation was something people thought was a reasonable thing to do. So, for example, my life partner and work partner too, the CEO of our institute, Caroline Welch, she was meditating for decades, and I always thought it was kind of some odd kind of just weird thing she just happened to do. And of course, in a marriage, you find your own differentiated ways of being, and then you link. So that's an integrated marriage. So she would do her thing, and I just thought it was a little weird. And then in academic circles, I think by my looking deeply at the mind as being, relational as much as embodied beyond just being in your skull, I was already kind of pushing the boundaries of what would allow me to be kind of seen as a reasonable scientist. So when people saw a book I wrote where I used the word be mindful in a parenting book and said, when do you teach us to meditate? This was way past the 90s. I was a little nervous because I thought, now they're going to think I'm a meditator or something like that. So right around that time, I was asked to be on a panel with a guy I'd never heard of named Jon Kabat-Zinn, who had been very, very effective at taking mindfulness meditation from one tradition and translating into a medical tradition and a medical practice. And he and I were on a panel together, and I said, I've read your 2 papers and 2 books or whatever, and it's amazing how mindfulness meditation in its outcomes seems to overlap with what I study, which is parent-child relationships, which is called attachment. So he said, look, that makes sense, and I pointed to the integrative areas of the brain that seem to be activated in both. And he then urged me to get training in the early 2000s in meditation. And so for the first time in my life, I did.
Did you do the mindfulness stress reduction program with him?
I ultimately did it after I did a week of silence at one of the Mind and Life scientists' retreats, the first one, actually. And John was actually there, but we were all silent, so you couldn't chat with each other. But what that started was a journey of not only being trained in MBSR, but realizing that what the wheel had been doing long before that was parallel to what mindfulness was doing in the medical field that John had brought for those years and for what had been done for thousands of years in a practice I've now just become aware of called mindfulness meditation. So we started a research center called the Mindful Awareness Research Center, but we don't just draw on mindfulness meditation, we draw on other practices like Tai Chi and yoga, centering prayer. There's lots of traditions that have the idea of being aware of the present moment on purpose without being swept up by expectations or judgments. And that's basically what it means to be mindful or to have mindful awareness. It's having a receptive awareness to what's happening as it's happening. And it sounds simple, but if every culture that we can find pretty much encourages you to do it for well-being, you might ask, well, maybe wisdom traditions all around the planet of all sorts of different traditions, the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu tradition, all of these traditions have a suggestion, find a way to be in the present moment. So what we've done in our center is look at what the scientific implications of that are. And then there are many centers around the world now that have systematically studied various aspects of mindfulness meditation. And the beautiful work from Richie Davidson, summarized with Dan Goleman in a wonderful book they have, Altered Traits, really summarizes these three pillars of this training. You could call it mind training. If you want, you could call it mindfulness, but some people don't particularly take to the word mindfulness. But these three pillars are focused attention, so strengthening the ability to focus attention. It's like the first two segments of the wheel, RIM. Then opening awareness, so it's where you're just sitting within the hub and being open to whatever arises. So it's open awareness. And the third one is kind intention, which is realizing we're all interconnected with each other. And so, seeing, quote, another person and being kind to them is actually a way of being kind to, quote, yourself. And I'm putting quotes around these because actually when you get deeply into these words, you realize the words sometimes trap us in a prison. And so, I much rather refer to the location of these things. So you want to have like an inner sense of kindness and an inter kindness. And when you start realizing that, amazingly, people start feeling a kind of relief that the separateness they've been feeling, which really leads to all sorts of very painful things, including sometimes people feeling meaninglessness and disconnection, and sometimes getting suicidal because it feels so meaningless. But when they realize, oh my God, I'm not Dan, who's just in a separate body. I'm also Patricia and Doro and everyone else we connect with, and who we are is like a plural verb rather than a singular noun. And then when people start to embrace that, not even like, oh, I want to figure out what this guy is saying, how weird is that, but they actually, they feel it. There's this relief, like, oh my God, finally we can realize we are all truly interconnected. And you probably felt it in the end of the wheel practice, where it isn't even just like, let me try to imagine the interconnections we have. It's more like, let me open up to the interconnections that are actually there.
This podcast today has been brought to you by Ignite Coffee. We developed a proprietary mixture of specialty-grade coffee beans, an amazing blend of anti-inflammatory spices, including turmeric, cardamom, cinnamon, matcha, and anche chilies, so you can do more than just wake up in the morning.
Order Ignite Coffee at www.bbrconsulting.us. Enjoy your coffee and ignite your life.
Wow. You said it this morning and you said it now that I think this morning you said the mind is a verb, not a noun. And did you just say our bodies are not a noun but a verb?
Well, in a way that is true. The body is all sorts of processes, and the cells are always turning over and that kind of thing. And in terms of the mind, what's so interesting about the mind, and it's so fascinating. Of course, this has been something I've been like obsessed with for about 25 years. But if you say Hippocrates may have had part of the truth, that the brain and the head contributes to the mind, let's say it that way. He didn't say that. He said it's the only source of the mind. And then William James basically said the same thing, that the father of modern psychology in James's case, Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. So we've had in medicine and psychology kind of a sometimes implied, but sometimes outwardly stated, mind is brain activity related to feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. So in this view, mind becomes fully embodied. And as a verb, then, it's in your whole body. But then what I've been trying to suggest in this field I'm in, interpersonal neurobiology, is that, yes, you have an inner, that's the personal side, but there's the betweenness. And you may say, well, wow, how can something be both within and between? It's two things, isn't it? Two places. And, so for me, it's actually one thing. It's energy and information flow, which can be studied. And the skull and the skin are not barriers to that flow to happen. So when you start really looking at this scientific suggestion of where the mind arises from, number one, you realize it's a verb, not a noun. Number two, you realize it's both inner and inter. One thing, the mind, is both within your skin encased body, beyond just the skull. So that's kind of makes some people go, whoa, that's kind of weird. But the other thing is it's between you. So being kind and caring and compassionate to others is, in quotes, others, is actually just who you are. And so you're compassionate, not because someone told you to do it, but it's just like, if you bumped your hand on a sharp object and you rubbed it to feel better, that's what you do, quote, to yourself, your body self. But other people's bodies are yourself in the sense that we are all deeply interconnected. So compassion becomes a natural way of living.
Wow. And that's why when you describe the inner searcher, what was it, the words that you used that you didn't think
the
was
inner compassion and the intercompassion.
Yeah.
Right. I think these words, we use them and we don't mean harm by them, but they create harm. Like saying, oh, it's all about yourself. Okay, well, actually, the deepest notion of self, that is, your identity on this planet, in this life that you're experiencing. Notice I didn't use self in any of those things.
Right.
If that's what you mean by self, it's happening in your relationships with other people and nature too. So if children were raised to realize the truth that, in fact, the children next to them who have different color skin, different religions, different genders, if we could realize that living beings, not just people, but nature, is a part of who we are. Think about how children will find meaning in their lives, connection in their lives. And those two things, meaning and connection, if you go all around this planet, which, I get the opportunity to do just because I'm an educator now, and I talk to people about, what really matters in life and what really matters for your health, comes down to those two things, meaning and connection. And even if you look at very carefully done scientific studies about what is going to be the best predictor of your medical health, called your health span, or your mental health, your psychological well-being, or how long you live, literally, your longevity, or how happy you are. It's your relationships, supportive relationships.
Wow.
So for me as a scientist, I say, look, to just put the mind up in the head is actually not very scientific, even if scientists primarily are saying that. Right. So this is where the idea of selfing, or this verbs of a self, needs to be a plural verb, right?
Yes.
Right.
It's happening within each of us here, the three of us talking to each other and everyone listening to us.
Right. Dan, but people say, well, you're on the airplane, you have to take oxygen first for yourself before you can help others. What do you say about that?
You have to take oxygen for your inner experience and care for your inner experience so that your inter-experience will have lots of energy and resourcefulness and resilience, completely. And you should enjoy your body.
Right.
This body is great. You should enjoy it. You should feed it. You should sleep your body really well, give your body great nutrition, exercise your body. So no one is taking the body away. What we're saying is the brain is important, the whole body is important, your relationships are important. They're differentiated aspects of your one mind and your one reality of life.
Right. When I was doing a little research, I read about the Healthy Mind Platter.
Yeah.
And based on the USDA food pyramid.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so David Rock and I, a colleague, got together and we said, hey, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is coming out with a new platter for what you should eat.
Right.
So we said, why don't we summarize the studies on what's called neuroplasticity, which is a part of neuroscience that studies how does the brain grow in response to experience. So then we basically summarized that and made it accessible in this nice little image. You can go to my website, drdanseigel.com, and you can turn it into a poster, whatever you want to do, because we made it for people to use in classrooms and clinics, wherever. So what the platter basically says is, let's take the science of a healthy brain, and let's turn it into, the 7 daily things you should do, and people can do them in different amounts each day. But they include very simple things. You probably have them right there, for taking time to sleep, one of the most under-focused things and critical things. Absolutely. Sleep is a time, among many, many things, you're integrating the knowledge that you've acquired during the day, but you're also cleaning up the inevitable toxins that your brain secretes inside the skull when it's busy, 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 active. It's kind of like a person who's hosting a party. There's a lot of stuff left over from the party. Well, if you're the host of the party, you don't try to clean up when you're engaging your guests. So that's when you're awake. So when the guests leave, okay, now you're in a different mode. You're in cleanup mode. That's what sleep is. And you need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. Like I realize I'm more like an 8.5 to 9 hour person, and realizing that and giving myself the respect to give my brain what it needed rather than having my alarm clock tell me when to wake up. I set my alarm for when I'm going to go to bed, right? Because then I say, yeah, this is the most important thing, is when getting those hours. So it's the cleanup time. And basically, if you don't get enough good quality sleep, you're poisoning your brain.
Wow.
I mean, I'm not just saying that like poetically. I mean, literally, the toxins that are secreted during active, healthy living day need to be cleaned up with sleep.
Right.
Wow.
That makes sense.
So
And how does that manifest itself, poisoning your brain? I mean, is that...
it manifests itself, if you haven't got enough sleep, especially for long periods of time, decreased attention, decreased memory, increased irritability, less capacity to be resilient in the face of challenges. And then as it goes on and on, basically you're not consolidating the learning, but you're also then accumulating all of these toxins, which, unfortunately, some studies, I don't want to freak people out, but some studies are suggesting that it leads to long-term damage to the brain, that can be forms of dementia, for example. So people are really saying, we've really, now that we understand at least one aspect of sleep, we need to put a lot of attention to, just like we would to nutrition or exercise.
Right.
Sleep needs to be up there, and that's why it's one of the 7 on the Healthy Mind Platter. The others are, move your body around, exercising, really important. And if you're limited, get some movement around. Just don't be so sedentary,
Right.
So that's number 2. There's also time for focusing attention, where you're really, focused time, you're really zeroing on something. And at the same time, there's also time for just downtime, where you're just letting yourself just let your mind wander. That's healthy, and a healthy time for creativity. So I think that's floor. We have sleep, active, focus. We have downtime. Then there's playtime. And I don't mean just being on a competitive sports team, but a time when you're really goofing around and not being judged for winning or losing. Letting creativity arise. It can be by yourself or joining with other people, and just playing. We, especially as adults, we give that up a lot, right? And then the 2 other times are, one are connecting time, connecting with other people on the planet, with nature, very important, with other people, very important, especially when people are like addicted to their screens. They're losing this connecting time. And the 7th one is something we've been talking about, which is called time in, which is where you take time to reflect inwardly, however that feels right for you. It could be moving and doing that, or when you're mindfully walking your dog instead of, busy being on your phone. Just be aware of your steps, or just take in the sights that are there, and just be aware of what's happening as it's happening. That's basically what being mindful is. Time in is a great phrase because we so often have time focused outwardly. You read the paper, let me do this, let me do that. But time in is just a way to remind yourself, oh, I see. It's reflecting inwardly. And that's the crucial aspect of it. And those are the 7 things. And listen, this is what science tells us. Those 7 things, and we put them on a Healthy Mind Platter just so you can see it, but it just comes from science. We didn't invent those things.
No, right.
We made up the fun little, diagram. But the bottom line is it's a science-inspired platter, a menu, it's like say, okay, Dan, what does science tell me I should do every day? Well, those are the 7 things you should do every day. And of course, there's nutrition. Now, we didn't put it on because the whole thing was a nutritional plate. But of course, you should eat well. But it's not
Right.
like a mind thing per se. It's something you should do absolutely as a part of that.
Right. When I was looking around, you have written so many books. How many books have you written?
I
And
think, I think it's about a dozen, and I've edited. I'm the founding editor for over 60.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
incredible. If you had one of your books to someone who was interested in learning about what you do, your research, the wheel, the healthy
Yeah.
mind platter, or whatever.
Right. Well, the best book would be Aware, the science and practice of presence. And, that book is in its final stages, so it'll be out soon, but before that book, I would say either Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human, which is a pretty deep dive into this stuff, so you have to be ready for it. If you want a lighter dive, it would be Mindsight, The New Science of Personal Transformation. And if someone's a professional, it might be The Mindful Therapist. And if someone's like a graduate student or like a researcher, it would be a book called The Developing Mind, How Relationships and the Brain Interact to Shape Who We Are. But that's like a super serious graduate textbook. And, it's funny because each of these books, because I have a ton of parenting books too, like Brainstorm or Parenting from the Inside Out. Some of them I've written with other people. But if you're a parent, those parenting books, Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, The Yes Brain, those would be books to look into for parenting.
Wow, lots of reading to do.
Really. Just
Yeah, but
amazing.
do them one at a time. I wouldn't read
Yeah,
all of them all at once.
So I guess one last question. Sitting here listening to you, I'm getting so energized, and the passion and excitement that you have for what you do is just incredible. And I think we're just so benefit from your major enthusiasm and your alignment into what I think you're meant to do.
Well, that's so sweet. Thank you. I mean, please come to our website, drdansiegel.com. And, there's so many different communities that we work with. I mean, we work with, recently, just a couple of days ago, I was with the Navy SEAL Foundation. I've worked with other military groups. I work with different government agencies, different organizations, not-profit, and also corporations. Work with lots of school systems at the superintendent level, and then at the individual school level, and then with the classroom teacher level. Sometimes I even go into schools. Recently, I did this in Jackson, Wyoming, where I taught all of the high school students for the entire city.
Oh, my
And it was mind-blowing. I mean, to be with them together. And then they let me teach the community, and then I taught all the teachers. And so you can do community-based interventions. And, then we work a lot with, people who are in the mental health field and medical fields, So there's lots of different, what's so exciting about this moment of all of us working together in this, including the wonderful work you're doing, is you say, well, we now have like this integrative science of well-being called interpersonal neurobiology that forms a foundation for the application of this in different worlds. So integrative health, for example, can build on that. And then if we all work collaboratively as a we, this integrated identity of me plus we equals we, together we can really bring more health and well-being into this world, which means making a more compassionate and a kinder world. This is what really comes all together, and it's inner and it's inter, and this is a really turning point, I think, in all these fields, actually finding a common ground and moving the world forward in a positive way.
Thank you, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And we're glad you like our peanut butter balls. I'll make sure you get that recipe.
They are delicious and healthy for you. But
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Trisha.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.